Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us here today. I just wanted to give you a little heads up that we'll be starting now, and the meeting is also recorded. We will be uploading it later on to our YouTube channel. And I will be passing on now to Professor Philip Patberg, the Director of ASI, for a little introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Paulina. It's great to have many of you here and our distinguished speakers as well this afternoon on this really exciting event on the European Green Deal and the election. So the European Green Deal is something that is already here. So we can discuss what we think about it and how it went. The elections are still to come, starting tomorrow in the Netherlands and then going on for a couple of days all across Europe. Exciting in a way because it is showing that Europe is alive in terms of its democracy, but also maybe scary for some people, at least reading some of the polls and hearing some of the rumors, because what many people believe to be important in the current situation, that is more environmental focus, more climate ambitions, more legislation, more activities might not happen because there's a growing or at least perceived part of the population that is very skeptical about this. So we're in this weird situation where we have a big flooding in Germany and everyone talks about it's happening right now. We also see a lot of activity among companies and civil society actually mainstreaming sustainability, but we have also sort of a backlash. So a really interesting, exciting time to discuss this with you and our distinguished speakers. My name is Philip Patberg. I'm a professor here at the VU and the director the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. Really briefly, the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute brings together colleagues from the VU, from all different faculties, from the medical faculty to religion and the hard sciences, and tries to make them all work together on sustainability. But as part of our mission, we also reach out to colleagues and to the broader audience to discuss important topics, one of which is indeed the Green Deal and the elections. So I'm really excited. Maybe just two sentences about what the Green Deal is. A really large, ambitious piece of EU strategy and legislation, actually aiming to make Europe the first region in the world to be fully climate neutral by 2050, with an ambitious interim target of minus 55% emissions already in 2030, with a lot of separate but partially related topics on transportation, agriculture and the food system, the energy transition, of course, climate change, but also foreign policy and many, many others. So really an ambitious part of legislation of the outgoing Commission and something that we are eager to discuss in light of the elections. So I'm looking forward to my esteemed colleagues and also to questions from the audience later. And so I wish you all a really intriguing, interesting debate. And of course, if you are in Europe and you're allowed to vote, please do that, because whatever your opinion is, it makes a difference. Thank you very much. And back to Pauline.
Thank you so much, Philip. I think that was a great opening. And I will now take a few minutes just to introduce our speakers for the day before passing on the floor to them. So we're going to start with Dr. Niels de Bonne, who is a senior analyst for food and agriculture at Milieudefensie. That's the Friends of the Earth Netherlands. And he was previously a colleague of ours at the IVM Institute for Environmental Studies at the VU. And he is focusing on pathways of sustainable intensification of European agriculture. Welcome, Niels. Thank you for being here with us. Özlem Tarzi, Dr. Özlem Tarzi is an assistant professor of international relations at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And her main area of research is the external relations of the European Union, and that includes the European Green Deal and its externalities, with a special focus on the Arctic region. And last but not least, we have Dr. Mathieu Blondel, and he is an assistant professor in the Environmental Policy Analysis Department at the IVM of VU Amsterdam, and his work is situated at the intersection of global energy and climate politics. Thank you so much to the three of you. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I'm looking forward to the session. We will begin with a brief statement round from each one of you. And we will begin with Niels, followed by Özlem, and then Mathieu. So if you could briefly state a little bit about yourself and how your work also links to the European Green Deal. Thank you so much. Passing it on to you, Niels.
Good afternoon, everybody. Look, I'm calling in from Vienna today, where we have a meeting with all the Friends of the Earth chapters from all over Europe, talking about food, agriculture, and biodiversity. So all of the biodiversity colleagues who have different teams work here together this week, and it's been quite interesting. First of all, because the train passed through all the flooded areas, so it added some of the drama that we maybe need to talk clearly about biodiversity issues and climate change. But also we're all very worried somehow now about what's coming up towards us, these elections in the EU. Before this, I was a researcher. I did some studies on how European agriculture kind of functions. And from these studies, I'm sad to say that I wasn't surprised by the revolt by farmers and others against the Green Deal. That didn't come as a surprise because, look, for example, we've lost just about 35% of our farmers in the last 15 years alone in Europe. Just imagine that one in three farmers has basically had to stop. We have basically seen a shift from what you could call peasantry towards what you could call contract farms, industrial farms. The speed and the extent of this change is different across different regions in Europe, but the overall picture is grow or go, go get bigger and intensify, or go bankrupt. And that's sort of what we have left now, the farmers we have left now, to a large extent, they are those survivors. And I've lived on one of those farms in the Netherlands. They were wonderful people, these farmers, and they were very good at what they did. But this is the reality that they have to operate in. And then suddenly comes the Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy, which was perceived as a big threat for them. I was not surprised that they revolted against this. Second, many studies have also shown how this farming system in Europe now works. It looks a bit like an hourglass. You have lots of consumers. We eat food and we buy agricultural products. You have lots of farmers, ever less, but still it's about a couple of million in Europe. And then in the middle, there is a small number really of very large companies. We're talking here about supermarkets. We're talking about some banks. We're talking also about fertilizer companies who really set the scene of how you can still farm in Europe. And basically you're limited to a sort of standard farm that you have to abide by, that ever has to grow as well. And still, the Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy, which was part of the Green Deal, was very much focused on getting farmers to change. Also academia, where I was working on sustainable identification, we were also focused on how can we make farmers change? And the answer to that question is, to a large extent, we can't, because the farmers, they are in this system that they have to grow or go, intensify, enlarge their scale. So I wasn't very surprised that this was perceived as unfair. Especially there's also other trends. Another study we did, mega trend study, also showed that it's not just getting larger. They also have climate change that is impacting our farmers. We have also environmental ceilings, and the nitrogen crisis is a ceiling. Suddenly we hit that ceiling, and we can't get over it. But the same is going on with antibiotics in animal systems, livestock systems, and there's a couple of these others, and we are running against these ceilings. While we have also with the common agricultural policy and with free trade agreements, and then with these industrialized farms, we have basically created a system where you have to run faster as a farmer, but on an increasingly narrow road. It's getting more narrow what you can do, because the EU comes with more rules that you have to abide by. So it creates a very, very difficult situation, and then you get protests. So that's why with Milieudefensie now, what we do is consistently focus on these, when you get back to this hourglass, focus on the people in the middle, the corporations in the middle. If you want to have less fertilizer use, focus on the fertilizer companies. If you want to have more organic agriculture, focus on the supermarkets and enforce that they sell more of those products and create a market for that. So that is what we do here. Yeah, and otherwise, I think the other way of trying to focus on the farmers or on the consumers is not going to be the most efficient. In a sense, the farm to fork strategy was going in the right direction. And that is also why I suspect many of the lobby groups of the agro industry were heavily lobbying against the farm to fork strategy. So because indeed it was going into this holistic perspective, trying to also address the people in the middle. Now that seemed to have caused some alarm, and now sadly not much is left of the farm to fork strategy. So lots of challenges ahead for us. Yeah, with that, I would encourage the Green Deal to reinvigorate itself and focus even more on the system players in the middle. But I have my doubts. I sometimes wonder whether they can, whether these corporations in the middle haven't become too powerful to regulate almost. And that's probably where also civil society comes in, and where we as Milieu Defensie might have some work to do as well. And I will conclude with that.
Thank you so much, Niels. I think that was a really nice introduction and already setting the scene for a really good discussion afterwards. I will now pass on to Dr. Özlem, and over to you for your brief introduction on your connection to the European Green Deal and your research as well.
Okay, thank you, Paulina. And I will try to build on what Niels has just said. So starting with the farm sector, which is very much the focus of the debate here today in the Netherlands. The area of my research is Europe's own climate vulnerable region, the European Arctic, but looking at the wider European perspective as well. I would like to bring into the discussion other sectors and further legislation created by the European Union about this green transition. And I also approach it quite critically in two aspects. I will argue that the Green Deal is not green. And secondly, that it is not sufficiently designed to carry out the transition that is to carry out, which indeed is not green. So let me explain what I will mean by that. I started my work by going through the legislation that has been created and the ones that really seem to open up new sectors of the economy, as well as to the ones that try to transform the industry. So I'll focus on the climate law and the adaptation strategy, then the industrial plan for net zero, critical raw materials act, the corporate due diligence directive for sustainability, and actually inherently it should also include human rights perhaps, and then the circularity act. All of these actually aim to transform the economy that we live in, but not necessarily in a green way as it claims to be. So first of all, to start with the green transition being required by the mitigation efforts for climate change. This climate law is accompanied by an adaptation strategy, and it has a very attractive motto. It says that we have to adapt to the unpreventable and prevent the unadaptable. But this unadaptable has not been defined. We do not know what is actually unacceptable for us. And basically having called certain issues as unacceptable would have actually helped to determine what goals we want to pursue. For now, this seems like a transition effort without a clear end goal in itself, having only said that this is green. But let me tell you where this is not green. Mainly because the transition foresees that we basically do away with carbon emissions through not using oil and gas, and therefore we need to rely more on electricity. And this not only brings into the building of renewable sources, wind farms or hydroelectricity, which for their regions are always receiving some complaints from the local residents, but also the massive dependence on batteries that we need to have for electrification. And batteries require critical raw materials and rare earth elements. And what this then does is to really multiply the need that we need on mining. And this is for now being carried out extensively in the Arctic region, but it will have to spread, mainly because this issue of critical raw materials has been designated as one issue area of geopolitical threats. The EU is highly reliant, especially on China, up to 98% of its consumption of these minerals. And therefore, now is coming with this plan that these minerals need to be either internally resourced or internally processed. And there have been also targets. The entire Green Deal legislation is about targets, right? So the Critical Raw Minerals Act foresees that 10% of these minerals of European consumption need to be extracted from within the EU, 25% has to be recycled within the EU, and 40% needs to be processed within the EU just to get away from these external dependencies. All of these are highly polluting industries. And the Critical Raw Materials Act states that if in the achievement of these targets, the implementation of these targets run against environmental protection targets, protection regulations inside the EU, then the Critical Raw Materials Act will prevail. The reasoning for this is that the European Commission believes that they have already created a very stringent environmental protection law inside the EU, and that it is robust enough to protect the European environment. Therefore, we can go ahead to build these industries inside the EU. Currently, these industries are either in Africa or in China or rest of Asia, and this is the source of pollution in all these regions. These will have to come to inside of Europe. So we have talked about, the land use, whether we should, within the debate inside the Netherlands, whether there should be nature protected areas or whether the farms and their land use need to change. Now we need to add mining on top of that. Because if we want to use the electronics and all these electricity reliant materials that we currently use, this will have to be. And perhaps part of the discussion should be about the consumptions, because all these targets are dependent on a certain percentage of European consumption, and we have never problematized what we consumed. So perhaps the discussion also needs to go there. In the production of these, the EU has tried to bring in not only government regulations, but also corporations into this debate by creating the Corporate Due Diligence Directive. But this goes mainly for very big corporations whose value chains most of the time depend on much smaller enterprises. And SMEs and smaller enterprises are out of this legislation. So actually, they do not need to comply with the reporting requirements that will target these industries. But there seems to be a way out, which is the Circularity Act. Circularity Act basically foresees that for all these consumption that we are doing on these materials, that we do not necessarily own them. I mean, being relatively young people here, we know how many phone of our lives we are already using, how many computers we have so far owned and such. And all of them, at least in my home, are mostly stuck somewhere. And this has not really been truly recycled. But imagine an economic system actually where this is what the Circularity Act foresees, that we will be renting out these services and the ownership will remain with the company that produced these goods. So the logic is that once the company remains as the owner of what they have produced, and everything that they have produced and have become for some reason unusable by the consumer, this will go back to them. This will necessitate, of course, a rethink of the entire production chain and the value chain, that the companies will also be forced that they need to be able to reuse every component of the products that they have produced. So actually, Circularity Act is the only rescue that I'm seeing here, that if we have to deal with climate change and if we have to do something, I think it passes through indeed the circularity perspective. And eventually, I think this will need to be regulated in a much more detailed manner to really truly deliver a green transition. And it all ends up to, depending on what we do with the land that we have. Are we going to protect the environment? Or are we going to use it for some function? Is it going to be industry? Is it going to be mining? Is it going to be farming, securing food security? I think we have very significant discussions to have among what type of use we want to make of this. And of course, I've never mentioned energy, and this is where I would pass the word on to Mathieu.
Thank you so much, Özlem. I think that was a beautiful segue to the introduction of our last speaker for the day. Let me welcome Dr. Mathieu Blondel, and a little introduction from you, please.
All right, thank you very much, and thank you also to the colleagues who've given great introductions themselves as well. So in my 5 minutes introduction, I want to take stock of 5 years of Green Deal discussions, policymaking, legislation, and of course now also contestation, as Philip already said as an introduction. I do base this on a short book chapter that I wrote at the end of last year called The EU Green Deal in the Age of Volatility. So if you're interested in a more elaborate discussion, I'm happy to refer to that, and I'm happy to put the link in the chat later on as well. And I think first of all that the colleagues have already emphasized that the Green Deal from the get-go actually really has always been about much more than just the climate or any other sector for that matter. And it really has always been basically a comprehensive view of what the EU could do and should become in the decades to come. And the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen at the launch of the Green Deal in 2019 called it the EU's man on the moon moment. And I think that we should really understand it as creating norms, creating institutions that will underpin the nature of the European Union basically for decades to come. And I'm very much convinced by that. And even with all its flaws, I think that it really creates a sort of framework as to what the future of the EU could look like. And I think what really is important, not just in terms of energy, but also looking at it not just from an internal perspective, but also from an external perspective. Because I think my argument is really underpinned by how the EU has reacted to 3 major shocks that have happened in the past 5 years to the international system, where the Green Deal has actually played a significant role, if not a foundational role, in the extent to which the EU has responded to these external shocks. The first one being the COVID-19 pandemic that we've all collectively blocked out of our memories in the past 2 years or so, Russia's war in Ukraine, and the growing discord between the United States and China. And really the EU's response to all these 3 shocks, these challenges, these existential threats almost, have been very much informed, if not really shaped by the Green Deal. Now, without going into too much detail, of course, because of time limitations, when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, again, the Green Deal has always said, or at least the EU better has always said that it wanted to build back greener, right? And it was really very much decided that climate action and the energy transition would be front and center in the response to the economic crisis that ensued from the pandemic. Remember how the recovery was indeed supposed to be green due to the built-in condition that 30% of the recovery budgets, the long-term budget, but also the next generation EU budget had to be spent on quote unquote fighting climate change. At the same time, of course, also throughout the pandemic, in the context of such a major shock and crisis, the EU relentlessly continued to pass key legislative elements of the Green Deal to cement it as the bedrock of future EU policymaking, such as the Fit for 55 package. And then second, Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, of course. Well, in response to Russia's war in Ukraine and its subsequent waging basically of an energy war in the EU Commission launched its Repower EU plan. And again, this wasn't so much only about getting rid of Russian fossil fuels, it was all about, or Russian energy, it was all about building a resilient, sustainable, secure, safe energy system that wasn't reliant on fossil fuels as a whole anymore. And again, Repower EU, the framework that was a response to this energy war, if you will, of Russia, is firmly embedded within the Green Deal. And the third shock is the clean tech race and, you know, this slowly us or a world creeping up to a Cold War 2.0 between the United States and China. Again, here we see how the EU has tried to respond to that, as Islam has pointed out already indirectly, with its Green Deal industrial plan, because China and the US have been bickering over control over low carbon supply chains, production value chains and production supply chains. And the EU was basically caught between a rock and a hard place, if you will, with China and the US controlling ever large swathes of these low carbon supply chains of critical minerals, of low carbon technologies like batteries, electric vehicles, heat pump production, etc., etc. But the EU has sought to respond with its Green Deal industrial plan, with its three elements, of course, the Net Zero Industry Act, the Critical Raw Materials Act, and the reform of the electricity market design in the EU. Now, that's basically looking back. Very briefly looking forward as well, if we see challenges and threats popping up internally and externally as well, I see that the Green Deal basically has some core tenets, some elements in there that could help us respond to these challenges that are now increasing. If you look at it internally, of course, as Philip already hinted at, there's increased contestation to climate policy, transition policies, etc. But here, again, the Green Deal actually already has some very important policy frameworks in place that could help neutralize, if you will, these challenges. And that is through these mechanisms that address this notion of the just transition. Think of the Just Transition Mechanism, the Just Transition Fund, but also the Social Climate Fund. And it has its limitations, all of them, but they're in place and they could help there, of course, as well. So that's one thing. Externally, again, as Islam has already hinted at, we have this legislation now, these policies in place when it comes to the Green Deal industrial plan, the Critical Raw Materials Act, but also the Net Zero Industry Act, that will help the EU navigate this increasingly volatile, fragmented economic and geopolitical reality as well. So I think that even with the challenges that we're now facing as a EU at the start of a new election cycle, I think that there is a solid foundation based on the European Green to deal with that stuff. And just very briefly to conclude, more than 70 years ago, actually, the predecessor of the Union as we know it today, the European Coal and Steel Community, was founded. And it was basically an energy treaty that was to forge a lasting peace on a war-torn continent. And today, there is war again on the continent. And it is cooperation, at least in my opinion, on energy and climate that will guide the way. And organizing, coordinating, and managing the energy transition and climate action is a massive challenge in and of itself already, let alone in this context of increased geopolitical volatility and fragmentation. But I do believe, and I am convinced, that the Green Deal will create a bedrock for building a better and a greener future. And I want to end on saying to everyone who's here, who's from Europe, go out and vote.
Thank you so much, Mattia, and thank you once again for reminding us that indeed this webinar is quite special in the sense that it is happening literally the day before we begin voting, and it is indeed forecasted as quite a significant vote for our future and for the future of the European Green Deal. Before we move on to the next session, I just wanted to briefly remind all the participants that you can post your questions to the speakers in the chat option that you can see above. And we'll be moderating the session and forwarding them to the speakers for them to answer. And in the meantime, as I'm sure you're preparing the questions for them, let us start with a little bit of a discussion with the participants involved. And as Maciej just mentioned, the European Green Deal and the creation thereof is indeed a very big challenge, and it's a really large roadmap that was created, touching upon a lot of different aspects. So indeed, a very monumental task. And just perhaps to place the European Green Deal in a wider context, I wanted to bring in the tensions and the implications of the introduction of the European Green Deal. So, of course, in the previous months, we have been seeing a very active farmers protest across a lot of European countries. But this is not the first time that we're seeing certain tensions that are related to the implementation of the EGD. So I wanted to ask you to reflect about these contestations and perhaps try to bring in your perspective on why it is that the EGD was faced with so many mixed reactions. And that's a very open question, also not targeted at any of you. So if one of you feels like, okay, I can sense I can start the conversation, please go for it. Mathieu, I think you're ready. So over to you.
Well, I'm not entirely sure if I'm ready to answer this question of why is the Green Deal contested, because that's a very big one. It's because any type of policy that you're implementing is going to be contested. I mean, I'm speaking now as a political scientist, of course, and perhaps not necessarily from an energy perspective, but it makes sense, you know, that such a far-reaching, all-encompassing policy framework that touches on, as we've discussed, you know, energy, climate, environment, agriculture, farming, whatnot, that's going to be contested. And if I mean, if you look at 2019, you know, in the run up to the elections then, because that's 5 years ago, then you saw that all these, in the Dutch context better, you saw that a lot of, in the run up to the creation of the European Green Deal, you saw that a lot of political parties were saying, yeah, hey, let's do a Green Deal, let's be climate neutral by 2050, great. Well, that sounds fantastic, but now 5 years later, we've been through the nitty-gritty and we're far from there when it comes to completing all the policy frameworks, as Niels talked about, for example, in terms of agriculture. So then the actual contestation takes place, because it's easy for everyone to say, hey, let's do this. Yeah, sure, great. But then when it comes to bringing together coalitions, making sure that stakeholders engage with each other, find consensus in order to say, okay, what does that mean in terms of intermediary targets? What does that mean in terms of which policies we have to implement, and what do these policies look like? What are the distributional effects of this, et cetera, et cetera? Then, of course, you're going to create contestation, whether it's in energy, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in any other industry, of course. So, I mean, the question isn't necessarily why is there contestation. The question is perhaps more, okay, what are the types of contestation and how can we overcome these?
Can I chip in a bit? Yeah, because I'm also, I think there is contestation because of the change. I agree with that. At the same time, maybe 2 weeks ago, a very, very, very important piece of environmental legislation was passed, the CSDD, which is super technical. It basically says that big companies must have a climate plan and it will be checked. That passed and nobody knows about it, and it's really important. So that teaches me 2 things. First of all, if you target big players, then there's maybe more consensus about that than if you target society at large. You target where the power really is, then things seem to move a bit more. And the second is, I think the Green Deal, and especially the farm to fork strategy, has suffered from political entrepreneurship. So the far rights, for sure, have been against the proposed measures of the Green Deal. That's not so surprising. What was more surprising was that the centrist parties suddenly found it necessary to, for example, kill the nature restoration law, or suddenly found it necessary to join the opposition against farm to fork and Green Deal measures. This surprising, for example, Alexander De Croo, who's the Prime Minister of Belgium, I don't think he has a big opinion about the Green Deal, but suddenly he found it necessary to mobilize, to use his voice in the Commission, which he was a president of, and he shouldn't have done that, to organize opposition against the nature restoration law. That is not about the content. That is not about the argumentation. That's about political entrepreneurship, where you create a wedge. You see it, there's a wedge, and there's two sides of a debate, and you find it useful for your purposes to position yourself on one side of that wedge. It has nothing to do with the quality of the Green Deal, in my opinion.
Philip?
Yeah, so I promised to say some things in the end, but I realized maybe I can just say something already right now before we go into more questions from the audience. I think we're getting some, and also, of course, inviting Özlem back. I just realized that you all had something in common, and that's that you all said actually the Green Deal is pretty good. It has flaws, obviously, but there is stuff that's quite, it goes in the right direction, has the right intentions, and I think that's interesting to realize. It is a quite far-reaching strategy and agenda, and you have outlined various aspects of it. So the way I think about it is a bit, actually, it's already working a bit because it hurts, and when something hurts, then you get, of course, pushback. And then, of course, I'm not saying there is no reason to push back something. Of course, it's not imagined, but I think it shows that what it tries to do is to change really some deeper flaws of, industrial organization, of foreign policy, of dependence, and so on, is starting to show results. And one of the effects of those results is that you see pushback. So we're in this weird situation that I'm sort of grinning because I want to say, like, I see it's starting to work. And so I'm not really surprised that there's a bit of a backlash. Of course, we will also see how big it is. Maybe we can turn a little bit to what we expect from the elections also soon, because the elections are tomorrow. They are not done yet, so it's all just really big guessing and sort of already being depressed. But maybe we're surprised. So let's hope for that and seeing if there are questions from the audience. So I will be short in the end because I took my time already. Thanks.
Thank you, Philip. Özlem, perhaps you would like to add a little bit on this topic of contestation and the challenges also faced by the European Green Deal?
Yes, I think it's great that elections are tomorrow, in the sense that there was really some pressure that had built up, and the elections should really function to ease that out, to see what different parts of the society want and what they care about, and how this then reflects into actions of political parties. So transitioning from the older version that our economies were running into a cleaner, greener version, of course, requires that burdens fall on shoulders. But whose shoulders reflects the power game part of politics. And I think, therefore, this, smaller business to big corporations to polluting industries to greener and cleaner transition, I think eventually these tensions within the Green Deal give us the perspective and the hope that this could be really dealt with and managed. But I think the results of the election is going to show in which way.
Thank you so much. Perhaps one more discussion point as we're collecting more questions. We've received the first one. That's perfect. We'll move on shortly to the Q&A entirely. I wanted to build on what you've just mentioned. So this idea of the consequences, or the heaviness falling onto someone's shoulders, and the question is, whose shoulders are those? And that's also something that Mathieu touched upon, this question of distributional effects. And in your introduction you also mentioned that now we will have to move a lot of the outsourced consequences back into the EU. So we're looking at perhaps growing disparities in the regions as well, because we will need to make decisions on how do we continue and how do we take this new trajectory. And another thing that we've been seeing also when it comes to the implementation of the European Green Deal is that indeed we have been seeing growing differences in inequalities when it comes to the different regions within the EU. So I wanted to pose this as the second conversation topic for the four of you. Philip, please feel free to jump back in if you would like, to reflect a little bit about maybe these hidden costs of European Green Deal that we've been noticing and some that we might be expected to notice? Maybe Özlem, right back at you. Perfect.
Yes, thank you. Actually, indeed, last week I was at the Arctic Congress that is attended by many European, but also American, Canadian, Asian participants. And it was primarily on the Green Deal because it's the polar regions that really are witnessing climate change at a rate that is about 4 times faster than the rest of the globe. And the discussion there was basically about eventually we will end up at creating sacrifice zones. This might be certain geographies as well as certain sectors of the society that will be pushed to deal with the sacrifices that need to be made for the green transition, and the rest are hoping that this is not going to be touching them. I don't think that this is a feasible way out, but it seems that for now, the way green transition is taking place, it seems that there are sacrifice zones or circles emerging. We'll stop at that.
I mean, if I may add very briefly, I think that we already see that, you know, these big mining projects, for example, lithium mining in Portugal being very much contested by local populations, but also rare earth element mining in Sweden, for example, that is severely contested by local communities and indigenous communities, the Sami people being affected by this idea of sacrifice zones or sacrifice peoples is something that resonates very much in scholarly circles as well. Not enough yet in policymaking circles, of course. But again, I mean, it's what you said, Paulina, right? It comes back to this idea of politics as, you know, trying to find or to redistribute costs and benefits of collective decisions and collective decision making, right? And then it's clear that, you know, certain stakeholder groups have more power, whether it's discursive power, material power, organizational power, lobbying power, and that they succeed better in driving through their own ideas, their own norms, their own objectives, and their own material interests, of course, than others that have far less access to these different types of power, if you will.
And just to note on that, this almost sounds like a populist argument. Maybe it is even, but like, okay, at the same time as we see these sacrifice zones, we see companies making absolute record profits. And especially after the crises that Mathieu was already mentioning, the oil companies made some of the biggest profits they ever made. So can we be surprised that people are slightly annoyed, to say the least, when then suddenly they are asked to pay more taxes on their fuel? And then we had, of course, the yellow vest movement. I get it. Maybe people don't make the full analysis of who gains, who loses, but they feel it in their bones that this is not a fair way forwards. Same goes with another crisis that we recently had was are having is the nitrogen crisis in the Netherlands. Okay, we're asking farmers to stop their business that some of them have been running for generations, while in the same time, when Rabobank was making a lot of profits, Ahold Delhaize was making a lot of profit, and all on that structure where they encouraged that kind of large-scale industrial farming that caused the nitrogen crisis. So yeah, who wins, who loses is a very pertinent question, and I think that's where you know, our policies are not actually that well designed. So yeah, I like the Green Deal, as Philip said. I do have some notes of how they distribute these burdens.
Philip, anything from your side when it comes to this question? No? All right. Perhaps with Niels's comment, I think it would be a very nice segue to bring in the first question from one of the audience members. And it's a question from a recent graduate that has been working on research on the European Green Deal. and the EU's global climate leadership discourse, specifically against the two prominent challenges of COVID-19, as mentioned by Namatia, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thank you so much for the question. And specifically, the participant asks that in the context of the recent farmer protests across Europe, can we evaluate this development as a new and internal challenge for the European Green Deal, especially considering that the elections are just around the corner? And can we evaluate this internal development for the future of the European Green Deal in a broader perspective? And if so, how? So is this a serious concern? Is that something that would indeed change how we look at the European Green Deal, how we do the European Green Deal?
I'm happy to have a first stab at this. Just this one word about is this new? What I found interesting was what Niels just said. I mean, think about it. Sure, to a certain extent is new, perhaps the magnitude of it, the extent to which perhaps it was coordinated. This all has to be seen, the extent to which that was actually the case across these different countries, because if I understood it correctly, I'm certainly not an expert on the farmers' protests. Different farmers from different countries were protesting different things as well. I think the Italian farmers were protesting a lot of different things than the Dutch ones and the French ones. But that's again, that's not my expertise. Perhaps Niels can add to that. But just the point that I want to make here is this new? I mean, what Niels also was saying earlier, if you look at the Yellow Vest protest, that was something that happened in 2018, prior to the previous European elections as well. So these types of protests against policies that are supposedly designed to address the climate crisis and climate change, etc., precisely because of the distributional effects that they have, are being protested by different groups in society. So in that sense, it's not necessarily something new, I would say. And the extent to which it can and will impact, for example, election outcomes in different countries in Europe, I think it's a bit too early to say if I can take an academic way out of answering that question. And that's for a post-electoral analysis. But if anyone else has a view on that, please.
Özlem, yeah.
I'm muted. You hear me now? I think the Green Deal will need to continue after the elections, and that there will be a new Green Deal. Mainly because, firstly, we are bound by the Paris Agreement. The EU committed to its making a lot. It has become part of identity and a vested interest of the EU globally to carry this forward. So there will be a new form of it, but I think there will be a new form of it. So what type and what shape it will take might change also significantly, in the sense that geopolitics and security concerns are now on the agenda to an extent they have not been in the designing times of this legislation. And yes, perhaps Critical Raw Materials Act will be even further securitized and strengthened to serve their production. But perhaps environmental protection may come into play, seeing what's happening in parts of the world where these industries are taking a bigger role. Perhaps the farming targets and the way costs are allocated in that industry will be juggled. So I believe it will need to continue, but I think we are also going to see some significant changes in the design. That's my take.
Niels, perhaps something to add to that?
Well, very briefly, I think I'm not an academic anymore. I can speak a bit more freely, I suppose. But I mean, some of these parties that are on the far right, or even over the center right, even they want to negotiate with physics sometimes. Yeah? So typically, physics doesn't negotiate back, and so they're delaying tactics, and that's what they're sometimes are doing, is just delaying. yeah, sorry, then you're, nature's gonna strike back at you soon enough, and people will be reminded. Question is, will it be? I mean, we are on a deadline here, and there is some urgency. We can't keep on postponing this. Actually, I would say the Green Deal came 10 years too late already.
Thank you so much for that. Perhaps I could ask you a little bit about your forecast. So what would actually happen if you were to look at potential future scenarios? Because as Özlem just mentioned, indeed, we might need a new form of the European Green Deal. And there has been some voices, obviously of opposition, but also of experts saying that perhaps this is not green enough, this is not ambitious enough. So if you were to attempt at looking into the near future, how could you describe the new European Green Deal? Do you think it's going to persevere? If so, in what form?
And okay, the negative side of this is maybe not. I think we shouldn't be naive. I mean, I heard you saying that, okay, it's part of our identity now. Maybe that's true to some extent. Some of the elements of the Green Deal will survive for sure, because also there is momentum. There's already industries that have formed around the Green Deal that you will not just uproot again. Yeah? So that will continue. But it is a possibility that ambitions will be lowered to a large extent, and that's what I'm really fearful of. And there's also a geopolitical possibility that there will be coalitions with other laggard countries, maybe a coalition with the far right in the United States, and so on. That might create a sort of global slowdown. And I mean, this is not just European. There is also, looking at the kind of the corporate capture of the IPCC and the COP processes, that's also part of this. Like, there's a whole movement now, and it's a strong movement, it's an organized movement that is trying to slow things down as much as possible, trying to spin false or very debatable stories about innovation and technology that will come to save us all. And that, I think, we just, as I said before, we just don't have time for this anymore right now.
Yeah, I'll be very brief because I saw some interesting questions in the chat as well. I mean, yes, sure, it will be adjusted to a certain extent, but I think if you're looking at the polls now, I'm not sure how reliable they are. Then I guess, I mean, the major groups in the European Parliament, the Social Democrats and the European People's Party, the Conservatives and the Liberals, they're more or less going to stay in similar size. So I think they're going to be forming the next loose coalition that, is going to be used to build the next 5 years of legislative packages, etc. So in that respect, I'm not entirely sure that there is going to be radical change to what we have now. So just briefly wanted to flag that as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Perhaps I will move on to the questions from the chat now. So we have one question about the countries that are actually outside of the EU, but are participating in this green transition, which, as Özlem already mentioned, at times is not really green. So in this specific case, the participant comes from Serbia that is also currently discussing battery production. And she is asking if there is a specific EU policy that applies to European countries that are not members of the EU and are facing the problems that are very much shared by other EU members in Europe. And if there's a certain piece of advice on what to do in a situation where this green transition is actually threatening water, land, agriculture, and whether you have any advice on this.
These are exactly the cases where I was saying that the green transition is not green at all. unfortunately. I think the benefit of being inside the EU is that one can take lawsuits, in the sense that when the EU was creating this Critical Raw Materials Act and the further industrial regulations facilitating green transition, they talk about the broader public interest in climate change mitigation, that if there was a clash between legislation such as Critical Raw Materials Act that facilitates this mining industries and environmental protection, then the Critical Raw Materials Act will prevail, because they are so self-confident that inside the EU, the environmental protection is good enough, which is not the case outside of the EU, and Serbia is a candidate country. So it should actually not only take on the Green Deal legislation, which is actually very few of that has passed through the entire legislative process, and the others are still in the pipeline, but the Critical Raw Materials Act has passed. The way out for Serbia could be to look at how much of the environmental laws they have already taken on. But I highly doubt whether, in the case of a candidate country that is not yet a member, whether the EU's own court processes would function or not. I highly doubt, and these even do not function inside the EU, because it has been written into the law that Critical Raw Materials Act will prevail in the case of a non-conflict. So this is indeed the case where there is almost no rescue from. And this is now happening inside Europe. So Serbia is in Europe, and I fear this is also going to get more inside into the EU itself as well. So this is the trend. I wish I could have said something that could show a way out, but I fear not.
Thank you. Any other takes on this question from our speakers? That was quite exhaustive, the answer from Özlem, I see. Perhaps we move on to the very final question that will wrap up our session before passing on to Philip. And it's about the focus of essentially the campaigns that have been going on, but also the discussions that have been going on around the upcoming elections. So one of the participants is saying that although they are very much in this bubble where climate policy is at the center of the discussion, when looking at the actual posters and statements of the campaign, it seems that the central focus is, do we need more or do we need less of EU? And the participant specifically is asking, what is the place of the European Green Deal and climate policy more generally in what seems to them as an increasingly Eurosceptic environment? Eurosceptic environment.
Who wants to have a go at that?
I mean, I could potentially. Again, I mean, more or less, EU has been in the debate actually since 2016, when UK decided to leave. In an environment in which negotiations for Brexit were to start, and also Trump was just newly elected inside the US, then the European Commission of the time came out with this suggestion, the Juncker Commission came up with this suggestion of presenting a white paper with 5 scenarios on a spectrum between more EU and less EU. I think this is the debate, especially in the realm of Euroscepticism, that is to be had. You know, do we want more of the EU and less of the EU? One of the scenarios was that, with the UK being the country that was using a lot of its veto in the making of substantial treaty changes or significant legislation that could bear an impact on, then it was kind of the Eurosceptic member state. And once the UK was out, one of the hopes was that there could be more EU, because the other member states seem to be much more willing to proceed with integration and for a stronger European place globally on security issues, on climate issues and such. And they had just succeeded in having the Paris Agreement, right? So this was a moment of potential revival for the EU. At the other end of the spectrum was the more Eurosceptic parties that said that actually we can have much less inside the EU. This doesn't mean that EU will disappear, it will continue, but perhaps do less collectively. And so a looser union with some cooperation ideas, no global achievement targets, no aims basically globally and such. And this is also another version of the EU. If the budget, this is what the European citizens at large, this could also this could also be the EU that we have. This is possible, and this is why the elections are so significant. We will decide what type of an EU we want. But then also this reflects on, in the face of climate change, in the face of war in Ukraine, in the face of global insecurities growing, not knowing whether the next American administration is going to be committed to European security, especially in the side of a belligerent Russia. Do we want to stand alone, individually, do less in the lesser Europe, or do we want to stay together and face these challenges together? This is, I think, what it is. It is more than the Green Deal, indeed. So that is correct. These elections are more than the Green Deal. It's just part of it, a significant part of it.
And I think it's also interesting to look again at the perspective of what the powerful players want here. And in this case, that would be the big corporations, but also the member states themselves, of course, as you also mentioned. Some of the member states are in a predicament where they want to have less of the schoolmaster EU. Yeah, the EU actually enforces rules that they don't like, and so like it kind of hurts their sovereignty sometimes. In the Netherlands with nitrogen, the biggest parties wanted to just go to the EU and get an exception and kind of start begging to the schoolmaster to not get a punishment. I mean, this was a kind of funny situation almost to be in. But I don't think they can actually get that from the EU, also because it would really hurt the other powerful players. If the EU creates a very nice thing for corporations, then that's a kind of level playing field where you do have a lot of rules and regulations that you must abide by, but within that context, there is also a lot of certainty, a lot of good business practices are being upheld by the EU as well. So don't think these corporate actors would like in a very extreme scenario for the Netherlands to leave the EU, for example. That would probably, especially after Brexit, would probably be resisted by not just many people, but also many corporations. It would be lobbied against. So that's the two horses that are pulling on this rope. I think the popular resistance against losing national sovereignty over things that you care about versus the powerful actors that might benefit a lot from what the EU offers.
Yeah, any last additions to that?
I'm going to keep it very, very brief because I know that we're going over time. For me, actually, it's a good thing that this is being so severely contested and so much debate is going on at the European level about the climate, because it shows that, it's part of a mature democratic debate in a mature policy field at the European level. So, I mean, positive, I'm saying that, but I mean, if you want to look at it through, a more, or if you want to look at it from a more positive perspective, for me, it's actually a good thing, because I mean, imagine this being pushed through all this legislation, all these policies by technocrats somewhere that have no democratic accountability whatsoever. So I think this is actually a good thing. And actually the European Union and Europe, the EU as a whole, actually there's not so many parliaments or countries, governments, states where so many pairs of eyes have a look at a piece of legislation before it's actually agreed on or implemented. But that's perhaps food for another discussion, EU policymaking processes.
Thank you so much. We will wrap up now. Thank you to all the speakers. I would also like to thank all the participants. My name is Paulina Raniecka. I'm the communications coordinator of the ASI Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. I also wanted to extend my thanks to a colleague of ours, Nele van den Bongard, who has been on the backstage also helping us with the seminar. And now for the final closing, I'm passing on to Philip again. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, and I keep it also short. I wanted to say I learned so much, and it was a fascinating debate. We could go on for hours because it is an important topic. I want to thank everyone for being here, also you as participants. Interesting questions. So just one thought I have is, of course, you can have a meaningful debate how much Europe you want, and that's actually why we are a democracy. Europe isn't something that we have to have. We can also say, yeah, we want less, we want a different, that's fine. I do believe that in a complex world in which we live, actually being together, being united and being strong is important. And if you just think about, there were elections in another major democracy in India recently. There's 1.4 billion Indians. And we're discussing here in Europe that we are this leader in the world and so on and so on. Very few people actually think of Europe as a leader anymore from the outside. And if we then further disintegrate, I'm not really sure if that would mean a lot for the things that we care about, and that's beyond left and right. I think there's a lot of stuff that actually people agree upon across the political spectrum. For example, sovereignty, which could very, very soon and very, very quickly erode if Europe isn't united. That's my personal opinion. Speaking on the Green Deal, it will not go away. It will be again reformed. It will stay with us in a way. But also, I think I heard that we need to have more discussions on how it can be implemented and can made to work quicker. Because also, as Niels has reminded us, these are really interesting theoretical and political debates. But there's also a reality of flooding as a metaphor out there, which is pushing us to consider that we need to act very, very decisively and fast. And we have to do this in an ever more contested environment. So we need more discussions, more thinking, and more people who help us to do this. So with this, a great thanks to our audience. And please carry this message on. And please join us again in the future for another SDG Academy of ASI. Thanks a lot, everyone, in particular to our great speakers and Paulina for moderating. Thanks a lot, and hopefully until very soon. And please go vote.